The roots of the Committee for a Workers' International don't just stem from 1974, when we were formally founded, but lie in the Trotskyist movement internationally. The Trotskyist movement, which was developed in the late 1920s and in the 1930s against the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and the influence of Stalinism in Russia and in the workers' movement internationally. In Britain, this was represented by the Militant Tendency, the organization which founded the CWI in 1974, which rather was the driving force behind the foundation of the CWI in 1974. While the Militant Tendency was based primarily in Britain, it always had an internationalist outlook, not just from the point of view of solidarity, but from the point of view of analyzing the political and social developments from the point of view of the world, looking at the world situation and then drawing the conclusions for the situation in Britain and in other countries. At the same time, even before the Committee for a Workers' International was formed, and before actually the Militant itself was launched in 1964, we had that same internationalist tradition, not just of discussion, but also of solidarity and activity, like when in the early 1960s, some of our comrades went to Algeria to help in the struggle of the Algerian people against French colonialism. But later on in the 1960s, we also carried out different solidarity campaigns, different actions, for instance, in regard to victims of the Greek military junta when it seized power in 1967, in solidarity with the French revolutionaries whose organizations were banned in June 1968 after the mighty general strike in France. We were always not just involved in solidarity, but also in discussing the basic ideas and discussing and analyzing new developments which were taking place. And that was also linked to how we were working in Britain. At that time, we were striving to win a majority inside the Labour Party Young Socialists, then the youth section of the Labour Party in Britain. But in striving to win a political majority inside the Young Socialists, international questions were very prominent, because we regarded the question of winning support for our position on the United Nations as a key test of our political influence inside the Young Socialists at that time. It was only when a majority of Young Socialists accepted our analysis of the United Nations as a talking shop and not as an instrument for socialist internationalism was that we actually agreed, or we actually saw that our majority, our political majority inside the Young Socialists was solid. Now, this in a way was part of our foundation for the work towards building and towards launching the CWI. And our activity for this launch was not simply organizational, but primarily political. And that meant analyzing and looking at the issues of the day, both the general developments and the particular issues in different countries, like the lessons of the French general strike in 1968, examining the crisis of the Stalinist countries at the time, whether it be the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, or the development of Maoism in China, the Cultural Revolution, and then the clashes, the military clashes between the Soviet Union and China in 1969. At the same time, we analyzed the development of the struggle of African Americans, the struggle not just for civil rights, but the development, for instance, of the Black Panther Party in a revolutionary direction, what it meant, how should Trotskyists orientate towards this movement. Similar questions were posed in regard to the first feminist movement, which was developing in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. The questions which came up in those struggles, they were key issues for us. And at the same time, part of that discussion was that we could learn from events. Yes, we defended the basic ideas of Marxism, but at the same time, we strove to learn from events, to analyze new developments as they took place, and also to learn from the experience of struggle, both our experiences and also the experience of other people as well. And this was reflected in our international activity before the CWI was born. For instance, in Ireland, in the late 1960s, when you had the development of the civil rights movement, which then developed into a wider movement against the oppression in Northern Ireland, we immediately strove to meet with activists in Northern Ireland, to discuss with them, to learn about the situation, and also to advance a program. And advancing a program was also a question of principle. For instance, when the British government put members of the British armed forces on the streets of Northern Ireland in order to control the movement which was taking place there, unlike other groups on the left, we opposed that deployment from the very beginning and tried to put forward an alternative of how workers' action could prevent the development of further development of sectarian clashes between the different communities, and strive to build a united movement which could actually struggle for change. And this activity, these discussions, formed the basis for the development of what became a CWI group in Ireland, which was already forming before the CWI itself was actually launched. Now, when we discussed about building with other people, when we discussed about building the CWI, we always tried to do it on the basis of a principled agreement. Increasingly in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, we were able to meet more activists, people who were attracted both by what the work we were doing, the way in which we were able to use our position in the Young Socialists to build our own forces, how we were beginning to also sink serious roots into the trade unions in Britain. And this, if you like, was the basis upon which we were able to attract people towards the CWI, a combination of our ideas and with the practical work which we were doing. The fact that we weren't just discussing abstractly, but we were involved concretely in struggle. And it was against the basis that we had the founding meeting which launched the CWI on April the 20th and 21st in London in 1974. And that meeting was a very enthusiastic meeting. Yes, we knew we were small. Yes, we knew that some of the groups which were joining us in the CWI were really only a handful of individuals at that time. But nevertheless, we had confidence both in our ideas and also in how the workers' movement could develop, that it could be possible to build our forces when the opportunities allowed inside the workers' movement, and thereby be able to build a significant force. So we were very clear about our ideas. We were also realistic about our strength, what forces we had. We weren't a mass movement. We weren't represented on all the continents of the world at that time. But nevertheless, we had confidence that ideas and the development of events would allow us to grow. And that confidence, if you like, was in the movement, in how events could develop, was confirmed 4 days after the CWI was formed, when we had the beginning of the revolution in Portugal on April 25th, 1974, when we saw the overthrow of the decades-long dictatorship which existed in Portugal. And by the way, we should say that dictatorship was supported by NATO. Portugal was a founding member of NATO, which shows all this talk about NATO being an instrument for democracy isn't the case. For the first half of its existence, it had a dictatorship as a member. But the Portuguese Revolution had a profound effect because at that time it was so radical. It moved in a socialist direction. There was a whole debate in Portugal as to how to achieve socialism. That was seen as the vision of the future in Portugal. And within weeks, we were able to intervene in Portugal. We had comrades who went to Portugal. We produced in Portuguese a pamphlet entitled "Portugal, the Socialist Revolution has begun." And on that basis, we began to intervene. And this set the tradition of the CWI. Then whenever we could, when there were movements, when there were struggles, when there were revolutions taking place, we sought to intervene. We sought to go to those, if we didn't know people already, we sought to go to those places to meet people, to discuss with them, to learn about the situation, at the same time to see what we could do to win people to our ideas. And while we didn't immediately do this in Portugal in 1974, a few months later, we had the collapse of the military regime in Greece, which also set off a revolutionary movement. And rapidly, we came in contact with two groups of two groups of Greek revolutionaries who agreed with our ideas, who both wanted to join the CWI, and they themselves joined together, they fused to become the CWI in Greece by the end of 1974. And that was a real example of how we could intervene in events and try and use them as a way of learning about those events, but also building support for our ideas and our program. Now, most of the people who were at the founding conference in 1974 either came from Europe or lived in Europe. But at the same time, we had a small force in Sri Lanka who supported our ideas. In Sri Lanka, we had a situation where what the first mass Trotskyist party in the world, a party which had developed from the 1930s onwards, had become effectively reformist, that they joined Popular Front governments, which carrying out a few radical measures, nevertheless based themselves on the continuation of capitalism. And this meant that those Popular Front governments ended in disaster and in fact paved the way for right-wing governments. And within the old Trotskyist party or ex-Trotskyist party, there was an opposition developing. We were a small force in 1974 when the CWI was launched, but within just over 3 years, we were able to win a majority of the activists of that old party for the idea of a break with the old party and forming a new party, which was called then the NSSP, forming a party which was based upon the genuine ideas of the revolutionary Marxism, the genuine ideas of Trotskyism. And that also was an illustration in the early days of the CWI of how the combination of clear ideas and events and experiences can make those ideas a material force. They can capture a real basis of support. And in that way, the history of the CWI since then has been not in a straight line, but we've seen many examples of when we've been able to intervene in mass movements, when even in Britain in the 1980s, we were able to spark off mass movements, whether it would be in Liverpool or whether later in Britain against the poll tax, which the then Thatcher government introduced. We were able to use those as ways of not just advancing struggle, which is key, and trying to win concessions, and we defeated the poll tax in Britain, but also as a way of demonstrating in practice how we actually work. And it's on that sort of tradition that we look forward to the future in actually being able to build a CWI. Obviously, we made mistakes in our history. We made misjudgments. We possibly missed different opportunities. That is clear. No work is perfect. But what we have been able to do in the last 50 years is to gather experience, is to learn from our interventions, but also in particular, train a number of new generations of activists who are based on our ideas and able to carry out the work today. There are very few comrades who were at the founding meeting 50 years ago who are still active today, who are still able to be active today. And the fact that we're continuing and we're growing is an indication of our strength. And we appeal to those who are attracted to our ideas to participate with us in not just building the CWI, but building the forces which can carry through the real fundamental socialist change, the socialist revolution, which the world still needs today.